Hi everyone. Detective Lefebre speaks. It was a night fit for tragedy. The rain lashed against my office window like a relentless tide, and the dim glow of the street lamp outside flickered ominously. My phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet. It was Detective Hargrove, his voice carrying a weight that told me this was no ordinary case. "Richard Hammond's dead," he said without preamble. I knew the name. Hammond was a real estate magnate, a man who'd built his empire from nothing, feared and respected in equal measure. "Murder?" I asked, already pulling on my coat. "Looks that way," Hargrove replied. "His son, Peter, found the body." The drive to the Hammond estate was a battle against the storm. Lightning illuminated the mansion in fleeting bursts, each flash revealing its grandeur, a stark contrast to the darkness within. This wasn't going to be a straightforward investigation. I could feel it in my bones. The mansion loomed over me as I stepped inside, its high ceilings and ornate decor a testament to Richard Hammond's wealth. The study, where the body was discovered, was strangely quiet despite the crowd of investigators. Richard sat slumped in his chair, a look of frozen surprise on his face. A single bullet wound marred his chest, dark blood staining his shirt. The desk was pristine, save for a crystal glass of untouched brandy. I scanned the room, my eyes lingering on the details. The safe in the corner was open but undisturbed, its contents intact. A framed photograph on the desk caught my attention. Richard and his son, Peter, fishing on a sunny day. Richard's smile was genuine, but Peter's was tight, almost forced. I filed that away for later. Something about the room felt too perfect, too staged. "Where's Peter?" I asked. Hargrove gestured to the next room, where the young man was being questioned. Peter Hammond was the picture of grief, or at least he was trying to be. His eyes were red, but his tears felt performative, as though he was mimicking what sorrow should look like. "I was upstairs," he said, his voice trembling. "I heard a gunshot and ran down. He was already gone." I studied him carefully. Peter was in his late 20s, with the kind of face that could charm its way out of trouble. But there was something beneath the surface, a nervous energy that betrayed him. "Did you see anyone? Hear anything unusual before the shot?" I pressed. "No," he replied too quickly. "It was just us in the house." "Just you, your father, and the housekeeper?" "Yes, Mrs. Grant was in the kitchen. She didn't see anything either." His answers were tight, controlled, as though he'd rehearsed them. It was my job to unravel the truth from the performance. Mrs. Grant was a stark contrast to Peter. A woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor, she was visibly shaken but cooperative. "I was making tea," she explained. "I heard the shot and dropped the kettle. When I ran out, Peter was already in the study, just standing there." Her words struck me. Standing there? What was he doing? "Nothing," she said hesitantly. "He wasn't touching his father or calling for help. He was just staring." I pressed further. "How long between the shot and when you saw him?" "Seconds, maybe. It all happened so fast." Her account painted a picture of Peter that didn't align with his story. If he had truly been upstairs, how had he gotten to the study so quickly? And why hadn't he tried to help his father? These inconsistencies were small but crucial. The open safe in the study gnawed at me. Inside were documents, a stack of cash, and a handgun. The police had already bagged the weapon, and ballistics confirmed it was the one used in the murder. The safe hadn't been forced, which meant someone with the combination had opened it. Richard Hammond and Peter were the only ones who knew the code. When questioned, Peter admitted he had access. "My father trusted me," he said, his tone defensive. "I'd never use it against him." But the facts were stacking up against him. The gun was clean, wiped of prints, but Peter's access to it made him the prime suspect. Still, something didn't add up. Why kill your father in such a way that points straight back to you? Either Peter was confident he could outsmart the investigation, or there was more to the story. Money often lies at the heart of these tragedies, and this case was no exception. I obtained a copy of Richard Hammond's will, which revealed a clear motive. Peter was set to inherit almost the entire estate, save for a few charitable donations. But a recent amendment caught my attention. According to Hammond's lawyer, he'd been planning to disinherit Peter entirely. The change was set to go into effect within days. This revelation painted a damning picture. Peter, drowning in gambling debts, had everything to gain and nothing to lose by acting before the new will could take effect. But even with a clear motive, I needed more. The evidence had to be airtight. I dug into Peter's financial history and found a mess. Gambling was his vice, and he owed money to dangerous people. Bank records showed multiple loans, all taken out in desperation. His accounts were overdrawn, his credit cards maxed out. Peter's entire life was a ticking time bomb, and the inheritance was his only salvation. I spoke to one of Peter's acquaintances, a man named Jake who frequented the same poker tables. "Peter's a smooth talker," Jake said, "but he's bad at cards. He was in deep with some guys you don't cross." "Did he ever mention his father?" "All the time," Jake replied. "He used to joke that his dad's money would solve all his problems. Only, I don't think he was joking." Peter's desperation was evident. But desperation alone doesn't convict a man. It only sets the stage. The forensic team conducted a gunpowder residue test on Peter's clothing. The results were damning. Traces of gunpowder were found on his left sleeve, recent enough to link him to the shooting. When confronted, Peter's reaction was telling. "That's impossible," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "I haven't touched that gun in years." "But you admit you had access to it?" I asked calmly. "Yes, but I didn't do this." His protests felt hollow. The residue was a physical connection between Peter and the murder weapon, but he clung to his story with the desperation of a man on the edge. Peter's claim that he was upstairs when the shot was fired didn't hold water under scrutiny. I pulled Mrs. Grant aside again to clarify the timeline. "You're sure he was already in the study when you came running?" I asked. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I heard the shot, dropped the kettle and ran. He was there by the time I got to the study door. It was too fast. He couldn't have been upstairs." The timing was tight, impossibly so, unless Peter had been in or near the study when the gun went off. I asked for a detailed timeline of everyone's movements that evening, and Mrs. Grant provided another clue. She'd heard footsteps in the hallway leading to the study just minutes before the shot. It wasn't conclusive, but it poked more holes in Peter's story. If he was lying about where he was, what else was he hiding? I decided to review the estate's security footage to see if technology could catch what human memory might miss. The Hammond estate had a robust security system with cameras positioned at key points, including the driveway. Reviewing the footage revealed something Peter had conveniently failed to mention. A car matching his had arrived earlier than his stated timeline suggested. Peter said he got home late that evening. I explained to Hargrove as we watched the grainy footage. This puts him at the house at least 30 minutes earlier than he claimed. The timestamp on the footage aligned suspiciously with the time of death. It wasn't just that Peter lied about being upstairs when the shot was fired. He lied about when he arrived home at all. When confronted, Peter faltered. I didn't think it mattered," he stammered. "I came home, went upstairs, and then your father wound up dead," I interrupted. "Why did you lie?" He opened his mouth as if to respond but said nothing. Silence was often more telling than words. The study's immaculate condition bothered me. Crimes of passion are rarely this neat. Yet Richard's desk looked almost curated. I revisited the scene, this time looking for what wasn't there. Richard was known for wearing a vintage Patek Philippe watch, a family heirloom worth a small fortune. It was nowhere to be found. "You're sure he was wearing it that day?" I asked Mrs. Grant. "Yes," she replied confidently. "He always wore it. He even wound it that morning. He called it his lucky charm." A missing heirloom of that value suggested either a robbery or an attempt to muddy the waters. I filed it away, but something told me it would be key. Later that evening, I paid Peter an unannounced visit. His facade of grief was crumbling, and his irritation at my persistence was growing. As we spoke, my eyes wandered to the desk in his home office. There, half concealed beneath some papers, was the watch. I gestured toward it. "Nice piece," I said casually. Peter froze. It's not what you think," he stammered, but his excuses were hollow. He didn't need to say more. His actions had already convicted him in my mind. By now, Peter's lies were stacked higher than his gambling debts. I needed a better understanding of his relationship with his father. Rachel, the family friend who had tipped me off about their recent argument, painted a picture of deep resentment. Richard was hard on him, Rachel admitted. He wanted Peter to succeed, but didn't know how to show it. Their fights were brutal. What about recently? I asked. Rachel hesitated. The last one was the worst. Peter forged Richard's signature on a loan. Richard found out and told him he was done. No more bailouts, no more second chances. He even threatened to change his will. The motive was now glaring. Peter, already teetering on the brink, saw his father's ultimatum as a death sentence. But proving he'd acted on that desperation would take more than hearsay. To catch a guilty man, you sometimes need to let him unravel himself. I invited Peter to the station under the guise of clarifying his statement. This time, I approached him less as an investigator and more as a confidant. It must have been hard, I said, feigning sympathy. Being under your father's shadow, always trying to prove yourself. Peter shifted uncomfortably, but didn't deny it. He had high standards, he muttered. Too high. Maybe? I get it. Sometimes people snap under that kind of pressure. His eyes flicked to me, searching for the trap. I didn't snap, he said defensively. I didn't do anything. Of course not, I said lightly. But what if someone thought you did? Like, say, a neighbor who saw your car arrive earlier than you said? Or a witness who saw you near the study? Peter's composure cracked. There's no witness, he blurted. No one saw me. He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. His own words were damning. There had been no mention of anyone seeing him, yet he'd instinctively denied it, revealing that he'd been at the scene. Peter's slip gave me the leverage I needed. A forensic sweep of the estate's hallway uncovered a faint footprint matching Peter's expensive loafers outside the study. Coupled with the gunpowder residue and the watch in his possession, the case against him was solidifying. But I still needed to explain why Peter had wiped the gun clean if he intended to claim innocence. A conversation with Hargrove provided clarity. It's panic, he said. He probably thought he could clean up the evidence, then decided to go with a fake alibi instead. It made sense. Peter had tried to be both the grieving son and the meticulous cover-up artist, but his inexperience had betrayed him. When I presented Peter with the full weight of the evidence, his lies about the timeline, the watch, the gunpowder residue, his bravado collapsed. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said finally, his voice hollow. I just wanted to scare him, to make him listen. The confession spilled out in fragments. Peter had confronted Richard in the study, demanding another bailout. When Richard refused and reiterated his plans to change the will, Peter saw red. He opened the safe, took the gun, and pointed it at his father, hoping to force him into submission. But when Richard stood firm, Peter pulled the trigger. I didn't think, Peter sobbed. It just happened. In his desperation to cover his tracks, he'd staged the scene, cleaned the weapon, and concocted the story of discovering the body. But the details he overlooked, timelines, gunpowder residue, the missing watch, had been his undoing. The case went to trial, where Peter's confession and the mountain of evidence sealed his fate. As I watched the gavel fall, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow, not for Peter, but for the tragedy of a family torn apart by greed. Money had been the catalyst, but at its core, this was a story of fractured bonds and misplaced priorities. Richard Hammond had built an empire, but he'd lost his son in the process. Peter, consumed by entitlement and desperation, had destroyed the very future he sought to claim. As I left the courtroom, the rain had stopped and the sun was breaking through the clouds. It was a small reminder that even in the darkest cases, there was light to be found, justice for the victim, and a lesson for those willing to see it. Peter's conviction brought a semblance of closure, but the aftermath of the case rippled far beyond the courtroom. The Hammond family's empire had been built on Richard's relentless ambition, and now it stood fractured, its legacy tarnished by betrayal and blood. I revisited the estate one last time, this time meeting with Rachel, the family friend who had offered key insights during the investigation. She had been named interim executor of Richard's will, a role she carried with visible reluctance. The house feels empty now, she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. It's strange how quickly it all unraveled. Rachel's words resonated with me. In cases like these, justice was rarely clean. Richard Hammond was gone. Peter was behind bars, and the estate, a monument to wealth and power, now felt like a mausoleum. But there was one question still nagging at me. How had Peter's life veered so far off course? I couldn't shake the need to understand Peter more deeply. As part of the trial, Peter had undergone a psychological evaluation, and I managed to obtain access to the report. It painted a damning picture. Peter's gambling addiction had spiraled out of control after a string of failed business ventures, leaving him feeling like the black sheep of the family. But what stood out was the toxic dynamic between father and son. Richard, despite his outward generosity, had been domineering, holding his financial support over Peter like a sword. Peter, in turn, had developed a sense of entitlement mixed with deep resentment. The murder wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and a desperate attempt to escape his father's shadow. This wasn't an excuse for Peter's actions, but it explained the storm that had brewed beneath the surface. The crime had been impulsive, but the seeds had been planted long before that fateful night. As I tied up the loose ends of the case, I revisited Mrs. Grant, the housekeeper whose testimony had helped dismantle Peter's alibi. I wanted to know more about what she had seen that night. She was reluctant at first, hesitant to relive the trauma, but eventually, she opened up. I heard them arguing earlier in the evening, she admitted. Mr. Hammond's voice was loud, angry. I didn't catch much, but I heard Peter say something about it not being fair. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I asked gently. I didn't think it mattered, she said, her hands wringing nervously. I thought they just had another fight. They argued a lot, you know. I didn't want to make things worse for Peter. Her silence had been born of misplaced loyalty, but it underscored how deeply family dynamics had shaped this tragedy. Even those who had witnessed the cracks were reluctant to acknowledge them until it was too late. Months after the case was officially closed, I found myself drawn back to the Hammond estate. Something about the study continued to haunt me. Standing in the room where Richard had died, I tried to imagine the final moments. The argument, the gun, the shot that had ended a life and destroyed another. The desk, now cleared of evidence, seemed almost mundane. But the open safe still felt symbolic, its contents untouched except for the missing gun. It wasn't greed that had driven Peter to kill. It was fear. Fear of losing everything, of being cut off, of facing the consequences of his own failures. The safe was a vault for secrets as much as money. Richard had kept his wealth locked away, and in the end, it had become a catalyst for his demise. Richard Hammond's death didn't just affect his family, it sent shockwaves through his business empire. I spoke to several of his former associates, who described the fallout in stark terms. The company's on shaky ground, one executive admitted. Without Richard, there's no vision. And now, with Peter's trial in the headlines, investors are pulling out. It was a grim irony. Richard had spent his life building something he hoped would outlast him, but his own son's actions had set it on a path to collapse. The Hammond name, once synonymous with success, was now a cautionary tale. One surprising figure emerged in the aftermath. Rachel, the family friend. She stepped in to stabilize the company, leveraging her own connections to keep it afloat. I'm not doing this for Peter, she told me firmly. I'm doing it for Richard's legacy and for the people who depend on this business. Rachel's resolve impressed me. She had no personal stake in the Hammond fortune, yet she was willing to shoulder the burden left in its wake. In a story dominated by greed and betrayal, her actions were a rare glimmer of selflessness. In the months following his conviction, Peter reached out to me through his lawyer. He wanted to talk. Curious but cautious, I agreed to meet him in the prison's visiting room. Peter looked older, his once polished appearance replaced by a weary, unshaven face. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly. I wanted you to know I never meant for it to go this far. Far, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. Your father is dead, and you're behind bars. How much further did you think it would go? He flinched but didn't argue. I thought I could fix everything, he said after a long pause. I thought if I could get the money, I could pay off my debts and I don't know. Start over. His regret felt genuine, but it came too late. The damage was done, and no amount of remorse could undo it. The Hammond case stayed with me, not because it was the most complex or the most shocking, but because it was so tragically human. It was a story of flawed people making flawed choices, of relationships strained to the breaking point, of ambition and entitlement colliding in deadly fashion. If there was one lesson to be learned, it was the danger of unresolved tensions. The cracks in the Hammond family's foundation had been visible for years, yet no one had acted to mend them. By the time the breaking point came, it was already too late. As I closed the file on the Hammond case, I found myself reflecting on my own life. Cases like this always left me wondering. How many of us carry secrets and resentments that could, under the right circumstances, lead to disaster? The storm had passed, both literally and metaphorically, but its effects lingered. For the Hammond family, there would be no true resolution, only the slow, painful process of rebuilding. For me, it was another case solved, another life unraveled, another reminder of the fragility of human nature. As I stepped out into the fading sunlight, I felt a strange sense of gratitude, not for the tragedy, but for the clarity it brought. In the end, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about understanding, about piecing together the why behind the what. If you like this story and want to watch more stories by Detective Lefebre, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment below. Remember, the truth is in details.